Well, today, Emily, Rishi Sunak had a story in two parts. So firstly, he told us that as we're still in the midst of the pandemic, financial support from the government, unprecedented in peacetime, will continue for another 6 months. But then the beginning of a reckoning, setting out a path to balance the books. So let's just take a look at the scale of the hit to the public finances after the Chancellor said that the COVID support package this year and next will cost £352 billion. And as you can see there, that involves £355 billion of borrowing this year. That works out at 17% of national income. Now, you know, there's one theme that unites the scale of that and the Chancellor's response. It's back to the 1960s. So let's take a look at this graph from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and that gives us an idea of the sheer scale of the borrowing. And if you look over there, as you can see, the headline debt, that's the pile of debt accumulated from all that borrowing. As you can see, that tops out at just under 110% of GDP in 2023-2024. We have not seen it at that levels since the 1960s. And here we can see, if we look at this graph, why the Chancellor is relatively relaxed at the moment. If you look, the red over there, low interest rates means that servicing that debt is relatively cheap. But both the Chancellor and the OBR warn that those happy days could end. And the Chancellor believes that he must eventually balance the books. And so he announced two tax-raising measures. Firstly, freezing the personal tax allowance and the threshold for the higher rate of income tax for 5 years from next year. That will raise £8 billion a year by 2025. And then raising corporation tax in 2023 from 19 to 25%. That will raise £17 billion a year by 2025. But you know what? Back to the 1960s again, and this seminal figure in the history of social democracy when we come to the repair job. So not since the era of Roy Jenkins have we seen a Chancellor presiding over such a high level of tax. Look at this tax, it's a graph here from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Look at that. It's saying that the overall tax burden will be 35% of GDP in a few years' time. So let's just listen to this economist.
The Chancellor has, in the budget statement today, leaned very, very heavily on tax rises as a way of balancing the books, introducing what looks to be the largest net tax rise of any budget since the 1993 one that Norman Lamont announced. And that is going to take, if all of those tax measures are implemented, that will take the tax burden back to the level that was last seen in the late 1960s.
Now, Rishi Sunak was asked about those charts showing the high tax burden, and this is what he had to say.
What your chart doesn't show is all the other chancellors, if any of them have had pandemics to deal with. We haven't had a pandemic like this in over 100 years. And so I think remember, that's why we're having this conversation. That's the problem that we're grappling with. And unsurprisingly, when you've had a shock like that, and then when you've had a response, in the likes of which we've done. I don't think any of those other chancellors probably have ever had to do as much fiscal support for the country as I have had to.
Now, Labour was rather unimpressed by all of this. Keir Starmer believes that once the pandemic is over, we will see a very different Chancellor.
Behind the spin, the videos and the photo ops, we all know the Chancellor doesn't believe in an active and enterprising government. We know he's itching to get back to his free market principles and to pull away support as quickly as he can. One day these restrictions will end. One day we'll all be able to take our masks off, and so will the Chancellor. And then you'll see who he really is.
Keir Starmer, well, while most eyes are on the budget today, another Brexit-related announcement was being made by the government, explaining that they would be taking unilateral measures to make it easier to export goods from GB to Northern Ireland by extending the so-called Brexit grace period. Nick's back. Tell us more.
Yes, so a major row has broken out between London and Brussels this evening after, as you say, the UK government announced that unilateral move to extend the grace period. That's for goods facing checks as they travel from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. Now, the grace period for food imports across the Irish Sea, they're due to end in April. And Lord Frost, David Frost, who's now taken charge of the UK's relations with the EU, he announced a 6-month extension until the end of October. He said he did have high-level consultations with the EU earlier this week, but the EU regards this as unilateral. They don't believe that they were properly consulted. So a fierce old reaction from Brussels. So Maros Šefčovič, who is the Vice President of the European Commission in charge of the Northern Ireland elements of Brexit, he describes this as a violation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And as you were saying, Emily, he says this is the second time that the UK is set to break international law, because you'll remember the UK last year planned and then abandoned plans to remove those parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, the EU is saying that that protocol, in which Northern Ireland remains largely in the orbit of the EU, they say that is the only way to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, David Frost spoke this evening to Maros Šefčovič over the phone, and he said, I am doing this because the way the protocol is being applied, it has a direct and disproportionate impact on the people of Northern Ireland, and it was never intended to be like that. It's interesting that Lord Frost has only just taken over all aspects of the UK's relations with the EU. Very different to Michael Gove, who's doing that job. He had a very good relationship with Maros Šefčovič. They used to do joint statements, working constructively. Clearly a very different approach from Lord Frost.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, on this day of the budget, I spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Stephen Barclay. I asked him why we'd heard so little about the NHS after such a big year for the health service. Was it ambitious enough? There was very little mention today of the NHS, which has, as you'll recognise, I'm sure, kept this country going this year. Now, the Nhs England budget will fall by nearly £9 billion after next year, from £148 billion to £139. Why wouldn't you put a significant boost into the NHS at this point?
Well, we have. I mean, this year alone, through COVID, we put huge addition of sums into the NHS. Through the long-term plan, there's been massive investment, 33 billion more going into the NHS at the end of the long-term plan compared to the start. So there's been huge investment, 100 billion into public services as we responded to COVID. So we have invested in our NHS, and we're also investing in the wider economy.
It is your own forecast that says the NHS budget will fall in England, and clearly this is before we get to a backlog of people that haven't been able to be treated, whether it's for cancer or for heart disease, over the last 12 months. The NHS is stretched to the seams, overwhelmed and exhausted. It would have been a good time to replenish a system on its knees, wouldn't it?
Well, we did at the spending review, Spending Review 20 in the autumn, in November. We allocated, for example, a further £1.5 billion specifically for some of the areas of catch-up that are required on the elective side. So funding has been allocated. You're absolutely right. That there will be backlogs as a result of the pandemic. But the NHS, as with the rest of public services, has had huge support through the pandemic. That indeed is why we've spent £350 billion as part of our response to the COVID pandemic.
But that budget will fall. Let's look at key workers, another cool part of the people who've kept this country going. Their pay has been frozen, even though they've been going into work in extremely difficult circumstances on minimum wages in a global pandemic. Their statutory sick pay is low, couldn't stay off work. Where was the announcement for them?
Well, it's not the case that the majority of people in the public sector will see their pay fall because, as we set out at the spending review, those earning below 24,000 will be protected. That is around 36% of the public sector. Around 1 million people within the NHS will also not be subject to the freeze. There'll also be pay progression within the public sector. But as the Chancellor set out last November, it is the case that many of your viewers who work in the private sector have suffered falls in their income. Many have been made unemployment. There have been impacts on the labour market within the private sector that we haven't seen to the same degree on the public sector side. So it is right that we balance these things and address the fact that the private sector has been particularly hit. But what matters most of all is that we support jobs across the economy. We get the economy reopened over the summer. We provide the support, as the Chancellor set out, through schemes like the furlough to get those jobs back, but then have a clear plan in terms of investing, getting business to invest in the high quality jobs which enable us to grow, because ultimately we need a strong economy to pay for those public services.
Social care, that's been at the heart of the COVID tragedy this year. You promised, we remember, to put a protective ring around it. Where is the big plan to sort out what that sector needs? The National Care Forum said today there was not even an acknowledgement. Where is that plan?
Well, again, there's been huge support going into social care as part of our response, things such as the funding for enhanced discharge, the funding that has gone in on infection control, various COVID funding measures to support the care sector over recent weeks. But it is important, ultimately, we get the economy as a whole moving. That is the best way that we can, through a strong economy, have strong public services, and that is what the Chancellor set out through the wider package of measures in the budget.
There's a massive hole where a strategy needs to be. You know that social care has been talked about for decades, and each time we're promised that something will come along, a plan to sort out what it needs, and it still hasn't.
Well, as I say, there's been a range of measures as we've gone through COVID to support the sector. It is a sector that has been particularly at the front line in terms of the pressures from the pandemic. But ultimately, there's a package of measures that have supported a whole range of sectors of the economy, protecting jobs, protecting those livelihoods, and ultimately it is through a strong economy that we're then able to fund the other things we want to see funded.
Universal credit, that uplift, will be a lifeline to those who depend upon it. That's been extended until October. Many are asking why it won't be permanent. We will see a cliff edge with people coming off furlough at the same time as people coming off universal credit with that uplift. And Action for Children are saying there is no quicker way of pushing children into poverty than by snatching that away.
But I think you need to look at that support in the round as part of the wider package of measures that the Chancellor has set out. For example, the support on rent, the support on council tax. We always said in terms of universal credit it was temporary, but it's been extended for a further 6 months, again recognising the wider pressures from COVID, but it is part of a wider package of support. But again, the best way of supporting those on benefits is actually by raising their skills, by enabling them to have better jobs. The best way we grow ourselves into a position to support the other things you mentioned in our public sector is by having a skills-led, infrastructure-led economy, and that is what the wider package delivered today.
But surely you want to raise their skills and raise those opportunities before you suddenly take away that £20 lifeline.
Well, it's part of a wider package, and you need to look at the support that is offered in the round in areas such as the local housing allowance, whether it's in terms of the support on council tax. There's a package of measures that we brought forward as part of our COVID response, and it needs to be viewed in the round as a package as opposed to individually.
Just last thing, as a former Brexit secretary, can you just explain to us why the UK government has unilaterally moved today to extend that grace period of GB to NI exports, i.e. goods moving to Northern Ireland, until October?
Well, we've always said that we will protect trade between GB and Northern Ireland and act in the interests of businesses in Northern Ireland. I was on a call with the Finance Minister from Northern Ireland today as part of our budget discussions, and our response to Brexit is exactly in the same guise. It's about protecting business between Northern Ireland and GB, and that is what the government is committed to doing.
Hang on, though, this was a unilateral move. The EU has said today it's the second time the UK government is set to breach international law. It undermines the UK's commitment to the implementation of the protocol. Why would the UK just do it unilaterally?
Well, we're committed to ensuring that we protect businesses in Northern Ireland. We've always been very clear about that. It is important. One of the key features, actually, of the budget was the illustration of the strength of all parts of the United Kingdom. And many of the measures we've announced today in the budget enable us to operate across the United Kingdom, particularly around business opportunities and levelling up opportunities. So that was a key theme of the budget, and our response to Brexit will be exactly in the same guise. balance.
But you can protect business by working with others. I just wonder whether that's how you see global Britain now, considered by our nearest allies to be untrustworthy or a bit sneaky, doing things on our own instead of waiting for our partners to work with us.
No, I think we've always been clear. The Prime Minister has been very clear that we want to have a good relationship with our European partners, to be good allies in that. But at the same time, we will defend the United Kingdom and ensure that business between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is supported, and that is where Lord Frost and others are particularly focused.
So when you use the word defend, it's as if you don't think the other side, the EU or Ireland, is on your side.
I think if you look at the budget today, one of our announcements was to support the 2030 World Cup, where we're going to be working with the Irish government as part of a UK-Ireland bid. There's many areas where we're keen to work both with our European partners, including on the vaccines and ensuring the response through COVAX and other areas works together, whether it's ensuring the Northern Protocol operates effectively, but also in terms of the effectiveness of the support we offer the business community in Northern Ireland. And the budget set out a range of measures today to support businesses across the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland. That's a key focus of the government, and it was a key theme of today's budget.
Steve Barclay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, joining us now, Jonathan Reynolds, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Jonathan Reynolds, just about every measure that you asked for, Labour asked for, whether it was extending the furlough, help for the self-employed, freeze on family taxes, they have done. There's very little room left for Labour now.
No, I think you're being far too generous to the Chancellor with that assessment. I think, first of all, the first thing we wanted in the budget was that clear roadmap to recovery, getting people back to work in particular. Now, I acknowledge what you're saying about furlough being extended. We did want that to happen. But even with that mitigating unemployment, the Chancellor announced a forecast of 6.5% unemployment. That's over 2 million people. Very, very high by recent standards. But also now you have the cliff edge put together of furlough ending, the self-employment scheme ending, and then a universal credit being cut. Now, that's very, very worrying. But for the bigger picture, the argument that Keir Starmer set out just a few weeks ago that we have to build back something better than what we had going into this crisis, that the British people deserve some hope. Well, the NHS budget being reduced next year, education, no mention of schools or the huge educational challenge for children who miss so much of their education, housing, councils, nothing. Even on climate change, very, very thin in the announcements that came forward today. So I just think this didn't deliver the scale of what was required. And for most people, what they're going to see is a very big increase in council tax, possibly a universal credit cut, and a very high level of unemployment, no matter where they live in the United Kingdom. Well, that just cannot be enough ambition.
OK, let's just go. Take me through the checklist of what Labour would or wouldn't do. Right to raise corporation tax in 2 years' time to 25%, yes?
Yes, we've made the case repeatedly that this country could compete with a higher level of corporation tax, still be a very low level. And if we spent that money on skills, infrastructure, we'd be more competitive if that's what we did. Now, that's not necessarily what I hear from the Chancellor, but on the point of raising corporation tax, we said no, not in the middle of a crisis. That's absolutely the right thing to do. But we are comfortable with a higher level of corporation tax that's still competitive if it's spent on making the country more competitive in other areas. OK, is it right to freeze personal tax allowance? Is it right to allow for that fiscal drag? Is it right to offer first-time buyers 95% mortgages? What would you say no to on that? Look, we can accept the personal allowance on mortgages. Frankly, it just feels like more of the same from the Tories. It's always some sort of inflation of the housing market. It's really about what's missing from the budget. Nothing on the long-term future, nothing addressing the big problems that we've seen that have made the crisis so much harder in the United Kingdom. You know, the inequality that people have experienced in this crisis, depending on their work situation, depending on their income, how it has affected different regions, how it's affected men and women in different ways. None of that is addressed in the ambition of what the Chancellor has announced today. And I think that is so disappointing. Out of every big crisis in British history. We've had the determination to build back something better, to learn the lessons. We haven't even seen any action on sick pay, despite the fact that is such a big problem for getting on top of infections. And it's just more of the same from the Conservative Party, and I just cannot see them fixing some of these problems because, to be frank, I think they are responsible for many of those problems to begin with.
Would you accept, though, that many of these measures are popular with the vast majority of the country? I mean, you've just said that there's nothing here that you wouldn't do. I'm wondering where Labour really manoeuvres on this.
Look, we manoeuvre on the fact that, first of all, this is not the roadmap to recovery that the country needs. And second of all, it's not addressing the really big things that people know were a problem. People know that one of the reasons we had such a disastrous situation in care homes is because the number of beds in the NHS was reduced by 15,000 over the last decade. And that has meant the NHS had to discharge people into care homes. The infection got there and the consequences of that were terrible. People understand that. Of course, right now, it's how you frame a question. People broadly in any crisis will say they prefer other people to have to bear the costs of that. And I think when they experience what it really means for them, they'll have a different view on it.
Let me just ask you briefly on the Northern Ireland Protocol, those unilateral measures to sort that out, to push back the grace period until October. Steve Barclay just told me it was about defending British business. You'd go along with that, presumably, that will to defend British business at a tricky time?
I thought, to be honest, some of that answer was incomprehensible, and that point about the World Cup I just didn't get at all. Brexit, leave remain, is over, but we have to be a good and reliable partner to the European Union. We have a shared interest, and acting unilaterally, threatening to break international law, I think that affects the United Kingdom in a very negative way. So I didn't get the comprehensive answer there from the Secretary of State that I thought we should have. And I'm worried about how the government still seems to be not able to move on from this divide and still wants to fight old battles.